Welcome to Podcasting on a Plane. It's a view of aviation from both sides of the mic. I'm Brendan Gonzalez. Thanks for being here. I know it's been a while. And I was thinking, you know that part of an 80s movie? Usually right in the beginning, probably still during the credits, where, it's like that montage that sets the tone of the movie. It's usually a really catchy song. It's a little kind of trancy, pretty serious. Yeah, that's the one. Well, if it isn't in the beginning, it's probably in the middle, right about when stuff gets pretty real. And that's what this episode is for sure, because today's show contains one of the most honest and straightforward talks I've had the pleasure of recording in a really long time. I struggled with what to name the episode, though. I thought maybe Revelation. That's the name of the song. Or maybe As Good as It Gets. But I didn't want to get sued by Jack Nicholson. So I settled on The Making of an Aviator, because that's what our conversation really ended up being about. And our guest is someone who would know. And as a matter of fact, after I recorded this interview you're going to hear today, I actually felt pretty refreshed. Like when someone says something that's so on point, you just can't forget it. Well, that's how I felt after we were done. Now, Rapp, he doesn't really need an introduction, but just in case you haven't heard of him, he's an ATP-rated pilot with experience in more than 60 aircraft types. And that experience includes tailwheel aircraft, aerobatics, formation flying, gliders, seaplanes, turboprops, business jets, warbirds, experimentals, radials, technologically advanced aircraft, and more. But Ron's logged more than 9,000 hours over the past 20 years doing a wide variety of stuff. He's volunteered with Angel Flight. He's written mile-long messages in the air as a sky-typer, crop-dusted with ex-military King Airs, flown across oceans in a Gulf Stream, and tumbled through the air in his Pitts S2B. His experience includes owning 3 aircraft, although thankfully not at the same time, and a long stint as an IAC aerobatics competitor up through the advanced level. And he has a particular fondness for the RV series, and he's instructed in all the 2-seat RV models. And on the other side of the coin, he's logged 1,000 hours in the Cirrus and the Columbia Corvallis series, and he's intimately familiar with a wide variety of glass panels and FMS systems. Okay, so he's obviously got the experience thing down. But what's cool about Ron is that he doesn't just keep it to himself. Ron writes for AOPA's Opinion Leaders blog, he writes for AOPA Pilot Magazine, the Turbine Edition, he pens the Captain Speaking column for Jet Gala Magazine. His work has also appeared in Sport Aviation, Sport Aerobatics, Airscape, CPA Magazine, General Aviation, Political Review, Nat Geo TV, KCRW, and various other publications and podcasts and TV programs. Okay, I'm done. And for 25 years he's been doing this. So, part 2, you're not going to want to miss. But first, I want to share a few articles about where we are with the 737 MAX situation. Our first article is called Boeing Provides Details of the 737 MAX Software Fix. It's by Stephen Pope on March 28th. The article says Boeing executives met on Wednesday in Renton, Washington with more than 200 pilots, airline representatives, and regulators to offer an update on planned software upgrades for the embattled 737 MAX fleet as the company tried to win support for the software fix and defended the process under which the airplanes were certified. The 737 MAX is the subject of a criminal investigation and a congressional inquiry that some in the aviation industry believe could have far-reaching implications for how aviation products are certified in the future. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao has called for an inquiry into the process at Boeing, which certifies new airplanes under the FAA's Organization Designation Authorization (ODA) program that gives company engineers and managers wide latitude in certification oversight. Some in Congress want the program to end, saying it's tantamount to, quote, putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. The FAA decided to do safety on the cheap, which is neither cheap nor safe, end quote, said Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat of Connecticut. He said he plans to introduce legislation to reform the ODA system, which he complained, quote, is so fatally riddled with flaws, end quote. Now, Boeing and the FAA disagree, because Boeing's engineers understand their products more deeply than FAA personnel, and they're in a better position to manage certification, the company says. Acting FAA Administrator Dan Elwell, speaking before the Senate Appropriations Committee Transportation Subcommittee, defended the ODA process, saying it's, quote, part of the fabric of what we've used to become as safe as we are today, end quote. Without it, he said, the FAA would need to hire 10,000 more employees and add $1.8 billion to its budget. The article continues later that the possibility that MCAS, in combination with faulty data fed through a single angle of attack sensor, could cause pilots to lose control at a critical moment, and that's shaken the confidence of global regulators and the airlines. Many pilots say they're angered that they were not given information about how to override MCAS in their training, which consisted of documentation about the 737 MAX 8 on an iPad. Now, Boeing's offered details on the new MCAS software, which is now being scrutinized by regulators. It would command MCAS to rely on information from 2 angle of attack sensors rather than just one, and an AOA disagree alert on the flight displays that was originally offered as an option will now be standard. And in the event of a sensor failure when the 2 sensors disagree by more than 5.5 degrees, the system just won't activate. MCAS will also only activate a single time instead of multiple times at set intervals, and MCAS will never be allowed to exceed a pilot's ability to pull back on the yoke and continue climbing, Boeing said. Even if the software update is successfully approved and there's never again an issue like the one that investigators believe may have brought down the 2 737 MAX 8 jets in the last 6 months, one in Indonesia and the other one in Ethiopia, killing hundreds, the public's confidence in the airplane and in Boeing has been badly shaken. So far, one airline, Garuda, Indonesia's national carrier, has canceled an order for 50 737 MAX 8s, and other airlines are weighing the fallout from the crisis as they warn flight cancellations due to the global grounding of the 737 MAX fleet that could drag on for weeks. American Airlines, which owns 24 737 MAXs, is canceling about 90 flights a day. Southwest Airlines, which has 34 737 MAX planes as part of its 750 large fleet of 737s, has been canceling an average of 130 of its 4,000 daily flights. United said it does not expect any further flight cancellations. The U.S. Department of Justice has reportedly subpoenaed Boeing as part of a criminal investigation into the certification and marketing practices for the 737 MAX, and the FBI in Renton, where Boeing has its production plant, is investigating the company's certification and marketing processes. Hearings in Congress will continue as Boeing and the FAA work to bring the MCAS software update to the 737 MAX fleet. The separate investigations into the 737 MAX 8 crashes, meanwhile, will likely take more than a year to complete. Again, that article by Stephen Pope at Flying. So as the story unfolds, the conversations I hear inevitably turn to when the lawsuits are going to start flying. And obviously there's a lot of finger pointing. But as the days go by, they're all pretty much pointed at Boeing now. Friend of the show, Rob Mark, writes in Flying Magazine Online an article called More Bad News for Boeing. Potential plaintiffs have until early June to join the class action. The article says that the people at Boeing probably expected more bad news today, and then they got some when Bernstein Liebhardt LLP, a New York-based law firm, filed a class action suit in the Northern District of Illinois against Boeing. The suit was filed on behalf of people who purchased, quote, securities of Boeing or the company, during the period of January 8, 2019 through March 21, 2019. In light of the Lion Air accident last October and the Ethiopian Airlines crash last month, the complaint alleges that Boeing violated Sections 10B and 20A of the Security Exchange Act of 1934. Plaintiffs seek to recover damages on behalf of all class members who invested in Boeing securities during the class period. Plaintiffs allege that defendants made misrepresentations about the safety of the company's 737 MAX airplanes during the class period, and specifically, defendants allegedly concealed that the 737 MAX airplanes lacked safety features with Boeing sold as, quote, optional add-ons, that most airlines did not purchase these safety options, and that the FAA handed oversight and certification of one of Boeing's safety systems to Boeing, which had a clear conflict of interest as it was rushing the 737 MAX to market. No details were made available about how many people may be involved in this class action, although information on the suit said the plaintiffs, quote, must meet certain requirements set forth in the applicable law and file appropriate papers no later than June 10, 2019, end quote. Again, that article by Rob Mark, senior editor at Flying, and you can learn more about him on episodes 37 and 42 of this podcast, and of course see more of his work at jetwine.com. Our last article here about the MAX is by Dominic Gates, and you'll remember his article comprised the bulk of the last episode, and when it comes to covering the MAX drama, he's absolutely crushing it, and I recommend you follow his writing in the Seattle Times. And this article is important because it talks about how Boeing is reacting to all this. And I've got to say, so far, I'd say they're actually taking ownership of it. The article is called Software Fix in the Works. It's up to Boeing to find answers to the questions raised by the crashes about both the reliability of the sensor equipment and the design of the MCAS flight controls. Meanwhile, Ethiopian Airlines is upholding the competence of the Flight 302 pilots, saying in a statement Thursday that they, quote, followed the Boeing recommended and FAA-approved emergency procedures to handle the most difficult emergency situation created on the airplane. Despite their hard work and full compliance with the emergency procedures, they could not recover the airplane from the persistence of nosediving, end quote, the statement added. Retired Boeing director Bob Bogash, a veteran of the local aviation scene, wrote in a note to peers Thursday that though Americans are, quote, so fond of bad-mouthing foreign air carriers, foreign pilots, foreign maintenance, etc., as the cause of our accidents, we do like their money, end quote. As a result of the Lion Air accident, he wrote, the Ethiopian crew was, quote, totally tuned in to the latest and greatest about the MAX and the MCAS system. It didn't help them. Hitting the stabilizer trim cutout switches didn't save them. Using the manual trim wheel didn't save them. end quote. His assessment is that the pilots on both flights acted, quote, calmly and professionally. Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg said that while Ethiopian and Lion Air tragedies continue to weigh heavily on our hearts and minds, Boeing remains confident in the fundamental safety of the 737 MAX. The imminent software update, he said, will eliminate the possibility of unintended MCAS activation and prevent an MCAS-related accident from ever happening again. Again, that article by Dominic Gates at the Seattle Times. In Wall Street, well, they seem to be in agreement. Our very last little bit of news here comes from Barron's, and the article is called Boeing Stock Rose Because a Fix for the 737 MAX is Here. And it's by Alroot. Boeing stock closed with healthy gains on Friday, a day after CEO Dennis Muilenburg said during remarks in Texas that a fix for the company's troubled 737 MAX has already been tested by airlines. Those remarks helped Boeing stock close up 2.5% for the day on Friday, closing at $379.64. On Thursday, the share price jumped $5 in the closing minutes of trading after Muilenburg spoke. Through Thursday's close, Boeing stock was down 11.5% since the second deadly crash of a 737 MAX jet in 5 months, compared with a 3.5% rise for the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the same span. The article later continues that Muilenburg told an assembled audience at an event in Dallas that pilots and leaders from 2/3 of Boeing's 737 MAX customers have participated in simulator sessions with the updated MCAS software. Muilenburg said, quote, the update will make the 737 MAX even safer by preventing erroneous angle of attack sensor readings from triggering the MCAS system, end quote. Muilenburg's comments, some of his first since saying an MCAS software fix would be ready in the coming weeks, will allay investor fears that correcting the 737 MAX problems could stretch into a lengthier ordeal than Boeing initially expected. Looking ahead, Muilenburg's confidence is important for the stock. He adhered to the original timeline, which lowers the risk of another 737 MAX production slowdown, and said, quote, our team has made 96 flights, totaling a little over 159 hours of airtime with the updated software. And then he added, we look forward to completing near-term milestones on the path to final certification, end quote. Links to all 4 of those articles can be found in the show notes. So, whether or not Boeing's in your current reality, or maybe still just a distant dream, it's where the talk you're about to hear starts, and in a time when things were a lot different. Yeah, I mean, companies that take a long view are usually doing a lot better than companies that just, take a short tactical view of things, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, when I looked on your website, when we first once upon a time talked about doing this podcast interview, one of the pictures I loved when I saw on there was you sitting in the co-pilot seat of a 727. And it really struck me because I have a picture of myself, not in a 727, but wearing my little pilot's uniform, just like the one you had. And then later on, the 727 was the first really serious jet that I got a lot of simulator time in, almost enough to get a type in. And so when I saw that picture, it really struck me as, I think this guy and I have a lot in common. And the more I clicked through your website, the more I learned that, you've been in this for a long, long time, and you've been writing and speaking and participating in so many different parts of the industry. It's kind of hard to know really where to start, but I want to start with that picture.
That picture, yes, is a classic. There's just certain things in your childhood that you always remember, certain moments. I mean, not just about aviation, but, and it's funny, when you're a kid, you don't always, or even when you're a parent, like with my own son, I don't necessarily know what the moments are that he's going to remember. If it was, you think it might be something momentous to us, like his first time at Disneyland, but you never know. It could be some totally inconsequential thing playing in the backyard or whatever. But for me, that picture happens to be one of those moments. It was, I think, probably the first time I flew on an airliner, and my mother had taken me to St. Louis to see my grandparents. And one time we had driven, but this time we flew. And of course, back then it was the 70s, so everybody got dressed up to fly. And so I had my little denim suit on and, matching sunglasses and the whole 9 yards. And that was, of course, a different era in the cockpit as well. You could bring people up into the cockpit during flight and things like that. And I actually do remember going up there during the flight. But afterwards, they'd spend some time with you and you got to see all the buttons and switches. And what's interesting is if you look at that picture, the guy who stayed behind and spent some time with me, look at his epaulets and he's got 2 of them. So he was the flight engineer. Wasn't the captain, or there was this guy, and I'm sure he forgot about it 2 minutes after our encounter. But for me, I mean, that's something I remember 4 decades later, and so I'm always cognizant of that when we're flying and we have kids or something like that. They want to come see the cockpit. I really try hard to make that happen because I know how amazing it can be. I mean, that was a 727, just a bunch of round gauges. Now, you go into the cockpit of a G650 and it looks like the Starship Enterprise.
Of course.
Even to someone who's typed on it. But I'm really glad that I have that picture, because it's something that I look at frequently, and I always remember the details of that day. So
Now, was that? Would you say that's where this whole aviation thing started, or did you already have it before that?
it's hard to say if I had it before that. I know I had the typical airplane toys and things like that as a kid. I remember a plastic float plane that I used to play with in the swimming pool, and different things like that. But it's one thing to play with toys; it's another to actually be on the aircraft and to fly, and to have that experience. So if that wasn't the starting point, it was pretty close to the beginning.
Sure. And then when did you actually start flying officially?
Officially, I started, I think, in '97, after I had gotten out of college, and I didn't do it with any career aspirations in mind. I simply wanted to fly for my own personal enjoyment and edification, and I enjoyed it so much I just kept going. I mean, I did the private pilot certificate, and then I learned at John Wayne Airport at a flight school where they're very good marketing. So it's largely an aerobatic flight school, and when you finish your private, they give you, as a thank you, a free hour of aerobatics. So they pay for the instructor and the plane and the fuel and everything, and you just get to go up and experience aerobatics. And so that hooks a lot of people on aerobatics, and that kind of started the next phase for me. I did that, and then I did my instrument rating, my commercial, and I was enjoying it. I really, I just took the next step. I started flying for Angel Flight because I had purchased a plane and wanted to make use of it. And that gave me a lot of experience flying with passengers and flying to different destinations. And it was very personally rewarding as well. And things kind of snowballed from there.
All right. So what were you doing then professionally that afforded you the opportunity to do all that extra training and stuff while you weren't doing it as a career path?
Well, it's funny. So I'm backing up a little bit just to looking at the personal side of my growing up. My parents died when I was pretty young, and I ended up living with my cousins. So my parents had been older when they had me, but one of the things that afforded me was the ability to have funds to pay for college. So I came out of college. This is probably unheard of for someone going to school today, but I came out of college with absolutely no debt. So that period in my life was sort of this magical time. I didn't realize it later until I started flight instructing, but because I later realized that every student that came in the door had seemed to have a limitation of either time or money or both. And flying requires a lot of both of those things. And I look back on it now, and that was a period in my time when I had plenty of both of those things. And I really didn't realize what a blessing it was until later. Like I say, when I started instructing, I was, wow, I really had it easy because I didn't have to struggle with either time or money. So when I was learning to fly, what I was doing was during the day, I was a web developer. The web was kind of a new thing, and I built a lot of websites for arts organizations in Orange County and other organizations. And at night, I was an opera singer. I actually sang with an opera company in Orange County, professional opera company. And then I sang for LA Opera a little bit. I sang for Long Beach, and I did a few other things. That's actually what I studied in college, was music and theater. So completely unrelated to flying in pretty much every regard.
Interesting. That reminds me of way back in my episode number 8. I read one of your articles, and it was the one that was called Know Thyself. And I liked how you combined basically what you just said there, your experiences in the arts and auditions and rejections, and, are you in the right place? Are you doing the thing that's right for you? And sometimes the world's just telling you that you're not. So let's back up a little bit there, and let's talk a little bit more about that article, because what you just said, I think, is very, very important to how your career's gone.
Absolutely. I sort of liken it to one of the toys that my kids play with, where you've got a ball and you've got different shapes, and you have to try and fit the proper shape into the proper hole. I think a lot of us, when we're younger especially, we're trying to find the shape to fit into that particular hole. we're trying to find a fit. And I've read somewhere some statistic that whatever people study in college, whatever they major in, very few of them end up working in that field. You might study business and work in education, or you might study, biology and end up in business. You never know. So I feel pretty fortunate to have found the proper fit early on. But what I was referring to in that article was where people end up in the aviation industry, because when people talk about working as a pilot, the average Joe just thinks of airlines. And there are a lot of people who are in the industry who really don't look much beyond that either. And the key to happiness, I think, is finding a good fit. So for some people, it's just not going to be the airline lifestyle. It'll be, and I've talked to so many people who are like, yes, I found helicopters, or I'm doing crop dusting or bush flying, whatever it may be. There are literally an unlimited number of different job possibilities out there. I used to do a gig where we did sky typing. There's an organization here in Southern California. There's one on the East Coast as well. And they fly these planes in formation, and they write letters using a kind of dot matrix pattern. And that was something I was very blessed to find. I really enjoyed doing it, and it's definitely a unique kind of flying. But for every person, there's going to be a good fit out there somewhere doing something. And I think that's really the key to happiness. So I tell people, look beyond just money and find something that you are passionate enough about, that you're willing to put in the kind of time and effort that it takes to be good, because it won't really seem as much like work when you do find that good fit.
Sure. Well, I mean, we talk on this podcast, of course, all the time about all the different things there are to do in aviation. And there's really there's no end to the list of things. You just, sort of popped off 4 or 5 of them right there that a lot of people don't even ever think about. So one of the things that I think you and I have talked about in the background a little bit is that aviation sort of operates as an ecosystem. It's not just a linear path, like learn to fly, get a job, fly, retire, that's it. Like there's so much else that's going on in aviation on the general side of things, on the airline operation side of things, and so on, that it really, one part can't exist without the other, right? And
exactly.
Yeah. And so when all these things start coming together, you start seeing the big picture of how it actually goes. But I think that there are some sort of shortfalls that are starting to show up in there. We mentioned a few, and I want to start getting into that kind of stuff, because there's a new generation coming in right now. Hiring is good, right? So there are schools like the Pilot Factory ones just churning out pilots left and right, and they're all basically going to go straight to a regional, and that's fine. But they're just turning them out so fast that there's an experience that's not really happening there. And I hear people talk about lack of stick and rudder skills, and I hear people talk about who's going to mentor this next generation, be it pilots or, you probably heard my interviews with Rob Mark where we're talking about who's going to mentor the next generation of aviation journalists, right? They're not even flying, but there's this whole generation coming up right now, and it's like, who's going to get them there? So where do we start tackling something like that?
Well, I think the first piece of this has to be a recognition by the aviation community in general that this structure, as you mentioned, it exists, this ecosystem. I always liken it to that the classic food pyramid that we all kind of learned about as kids, where the base of the pyramid was your carbohydrates, and then you'd have fruits and vegetables and meats and things, and then I think refined sugars and sweets up at the very top. Well, aviation is the same way. The base of that pyramid is general aviation. That's the support structure. That's the part without which the entire system collapses. And it's the thing that makes aviation in the United States so unique. In my day-to-day job, I fly all around the world. I've flown to Asia and Africa, to Europe, South America, all over the place. And aviation, as we know it here, does not exist in the rest of the world. I have friends who are Japanese, and if they want to fly aerobatics, they have to get on a plane, fly all the way across the Pacific Ocean, fly aerobatics for a couple days, and then fly home. Me, I go, 5 miles down the road, and I hop in a plane and I go fly, and aerobatics are everywhere. So without that general aviation, the rest of the system is going to fall apart. And the reason for that is because general aviation is where people get that experience. It's where they get the seasoning. It's where they do all those, for lack of a better word, crap jobs that they end up looking back on with a certain degree of fondness later in life. They don't necessarily pay well as far as your bank account's concerned, but they are what make a pilot into an aviator. Um, and they're very critical, and that's the feeder to the airlines, to the military, to uh, every aspect of aviation. So it's very, very critical. And that's general aviation is the part of the ecosystem that allows us to have the network of airports, the FBOs, the flight schools, all of the things that we sometimes take for granted in this country. And so I think the beginning part is the airlines, the military, the government. Everyone has to accept and recognize very clearly that this is a critical part of our aviation infrastructure, of our aviation industry, and in our overall economy. It's a purveyor of high skilled, high quality jobs, and it is uniquely American. And it's something that needs to be understood and preserved. You mentioned what they call ab initio for the airlines, where the airlines can't find the people that they're looking for. They can't find the labor. So now they're going to do what they do in Europe and in other parts of the world, where they hire people off the street who have absolutely no aviation experience whatsoever, and they'll turn them into airline pilots, which works. I mean, they do have airlines there, and that's how they do it. The problem is those programs are designed to produce airline pilots. So you only learn the things that are specific to airline flying. Other than that, it's just the bare minimum to get you through the certificates and ratings and get you into the cockpit as quickly as possible. I'm sure those are excellent pilots, but I don't know that they are going to have the stick and rudder skills or the breadth and depth of experience that we're used to in this country.
Sure. Now, what do you think about, in that kind of training? I know in other countries, you probably are hired on with your airline prior to doing that, and then they may cover the costs. But in the United States, kids are racking up. They're racking up mega debt in order to get a very, very low paying job. And, in that industry, you're probably not going to make, good money for maybe a decade or more, maybe two. So what do you think about that as a path, like as far as racking up debt and taking on loans in order, probably in addition to college student loans as well, in order to get a job in industry?
That's a tough one. Even outside of aviation, the cost of college is astronomical. I've got a 4-year-old, and I've got I'm already thinking about college and things like that for him. I've got a 529 account. I started contributing to that literally the day he was born. And it's funny, I was with my financial advisor, planning this and that. And the one thing that was so nebulous as far as trying to figure out a total was what's college going to cost in 15, 17 years. I have no idea. It can't keep going at the rate it's going. I mean, it would be $1 million a year at that point. It's just growing at an exponential rate. I sort of have my own personal theory that college is going to get cheaper because there's going to be competition from the online world. And I think there's going to be a resurgence of interest in technical schools and vocational training and things like that. But for kids coming up right now, it's a double whammy because you're paying for college and you're paying for flight school. Having said that, there are ways to make it cheaper, certainly. You can hit a junior college for the first 2 years. That can save a ton of money. Online schools can save a lot of money. I mean, it is possible. If you go to college in a place like Germany or somewhere, their schools are completely different than ours. It's more of like an industrial thing. You go to school, you go home, and that's it. They don't have the more luxurious, extensive campuses that we tend to know here. As far as flight training, you can apply the same logic. I know people who've learned to fly in an SR-22, where the airplane costs $250 an hour. I don't think that's a great choice for someone who has concerns about money. I'd rather see that person learn to fly in something like a Cub or a Champ or a Citabria. It's a plane that's much simpler, much cheaper, and it's got a tail wheel. It's going to teach you the basic stick and rudder skills that will serve you well throughout your career. It has the advantage as well of being a very simple airplane. So you don't have to master 50 different systems before you take your check ride, because those systems don't exist in that plane. It keeps your eyes outside. It keeps you focused on the basics. And so it's cheaper, it's more fun, I believe, and it's going to build a better pilot, and it'll cost a lot less. So there are ways to reduce the cost of flying, but that's not the way things trend. Just as Americans tend to opt toward higher end cars, higher end trim levels, that's what sells. That's where the profit margin is. The same thing goes on in the aviation business. I mean, Cirrus has their SR-20, but they don't sell anywhere near as many of those as they do of the high-end SR-22s. So, but for people starting out, I would love to see a flight school that just had those inexpensive tail wheels and really focused on getting people through their primary training at low cost.
Well, I feel like a couple of the manufacturers, Cessna in particular, I know they tried to enter that market with the 162 Skycatcher, but that was just a complete flop in a number of different ways. But I kind of, I wanted it to be a success, and I want to hand it to them for kind of doing what you're talking about, where they said, hey, look, we're going to make a simple aircraft. We can enter the light sport market. You can also use it for private pilot training, but it's just going to be a simple stick and rudder aircraft. And it was quite literally, it had a stick. It didn't even have a yoke.
Right.
But at the same time, I guess, like you said, that's the market didn't want that. That's not what it didn't pay, right?
Exactly. Well, and that part of the problem with the Skycatcher, I think, was that it was an LSA. And if you step back and look at the LSA world, it is a environment of artificially constrained airplanes, speed, altitude, weight limits, all these things. There's no reason that they needed to have any of those limitations put on them beyond the fact that there's a government edict saying so. So there's been some talk about expanding the LSA category to include, your 152s and your Cubs and things like that. And that would be a huge help. But I used to fly LSAs when I was teaching, and I never really got past the idea that these airplanes had all of these artificial limitations that were placed on them for no aeronautical reason.
Sure, yeah, it was just to meet the regulations to get it certified in that category, I guess.
And they were never as inexpensive as it was initially predicted that they would be, whereas you can buy an old Champ for, I don't know, $30,000. I mean, an LSA, you might pay $130,000.
Sure, of course. Now, I think no conversation about this would be complete unless we also bring a little bit of AOPA and the Yellowbird airplanes that they've been doing in partnership with Aviator. But, the idea of bringing back 152s, stripping them down and doing a complete resto mod in order to have a simple single-engine aircraft like the 152, but brought up to a slightly more modern standard, I think is a pretty good idea, although I'm not sure if they're exactly selling like hotcakes either. But what do you think about that?
I think there's nothing wrong with trying. The airframes are already out there. Eventually, they're going to have to be refurbished anyway. So there might as well be an organized way of doing that, So I certainly think it's worth a shot. At the end of the day, though, I think there's enough inexpensive airframes that are still out there with enough serviceable life in them that it's going to be hard to compete financially against the cost of those lower airplanes, of that fleet, if you will.
Sure. I mean, I've flown one and it was great. I really enjoyed it. But at the same time, it was relatively expensive. I mean, I realize they're for clubs and schools to buy and whatever, but you're getting into used bonanza territory with one of those. Right. So, the market, I mean, there's a little bit of a market for it, but at the same time, it is probably a pretty big check to write for a 152, no matter how nice it may be. But at the same time, I mean, I hope that they do sell some because, I mean, again, it's like you said, a very simple stick and rudder aircraft brought up to a modern standard. And, that may help people make that choice instead of just trying to go for, I bought a Cirrus and I'm going to learn to fly in that, and then sort of lack some of the skills that we may need.
Right. I think the future is actually not with the rebuilds, although there's going to be a lot of that refurbishment. But I think the real future lies in the experimental category. I think there have been more than 10,000 of the Vans RV series completed and flying. And I don't know how many are under construction. There's probably another 10,000. I mean, if this continues, eventually there's going to be more RVs than there are Cessnas out there, eventually. And those are planes that give you the performance of a Cirrus with the cost of a old, Taylorcraft or something like that. I mean, you could buy an airplane that'll do 200 miles an hour on 7 gallons per fuel for, I don't know, maybe $35,000. Already built. You don't even have to build it. There's ones for sale like that, like RV4s and things.
Sure. Now, what do you think about multi-engine training? Because there is definitely a lack of multi-engine trainers being built. I mean, I realize why. It's completely not economical. The only person who's going to buy a Seminole brand new is going to be a flight school. And at the same time, the multi-engine rating is becoming a thing where, flying a Seminole or a Seneca or something like that to learn to fly multi-engine is going to have little, if anything, to do with flying a CRJ. However, it's kind of the student's first introduction into more complicated systems, more complicated performance, being able to actually shut down an engine in flight and see what that's like. But what do you think about the future of multi-engine training?
That's a great question. I don't know where it's going to go, but when you get into multi-engine aircraft, the price rises exponentially. I mean, turboprops, jets, things like that. So compared to that, the Seminoles and the Senecas are actually a fairly economic choice. But yeah, they're it's funny. I think the ecosystem kind of runs backwards. Uh, get in the jet that I fly. I'm currently flying the Gulfstream G550. I mean, it is the easiest airplane to fly that I have ever flown. I mean, even on one engine, it just, you get in the sim and they'll fail an engine on you right at a critical moment on takeoff. And if, right after V1, and you really don't do anything. You fly away on one engine just as, and then you raise the landing gear and you don't do anything. You just sit there and climb, until you reach 1,500 feet. It's so simple. And you're sitting there with two pilots, whereas some guy who's pretty low time is out there trying to operate a Seneca or a Seminole on one engine and barely got enough performance to keep the thing climbing. You've got instructors doing, MCA demonstrations where you're really kind of flying the airplane on the edge. It's pretty risky stuff, the training is difficult and it's a lot to ask out of low time pilots. One of the multi-engine airplanes that seems to be selling quite well, it's still not being produced in huge numbers, but the DA-42 Twin Star. And I've worked with some people who've obtained their multi-engine rating in that aircraft. And it's very much like a jet. Instead of 6 levers, you've got 2. And when the engine quits or is shut down by the instructor, you don't really have to do anything. The engine stops very rapidly. The prop feathers itself, and you just maximize the power on the remaining engine and fly away. So I can see why the DA-42 is so popular with multi-engine trainers. It really makes things a lot simpler, but it also makes them a lot more like it would be flying a modern turboprop or jet.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, when I fly or instruct rather in multi-engine aircraft, I instruct in a Seminole somewhat regularly. And my observation has always been that when I get a student who's probably career track, they've just obtained their private, their instrument commercial, straight into the Seminole, they're just going to keep plugging away at this, then go get their CFI.
Right.
When they get in the Seminole, this is the first time where I really see them sort of grow that level of confidence where when they get in, they're like, I don't even know what's going on, right? I mean, it's just a twin engine T-tail Aero, really. But when they get in, they're just completely overwhelmed. But then 5-10 hours later, they finally have that professional pilot sort of tick about them. That confidence where they say, hey, look, an engine quit. And they just go about that workman-like process, fix it, don't let the airplane take advantage of them. And it's the first time that I really see that confidence come out. When I see that confidence come out, that is what we alluded to earlier with the stick and rudder skills, and that person is becoming an aviator. They're not just, a private pilot with an instrument rating. They're like an aviator now. They have that strength. They have the confidence. They have the knowledge. So would you say that despite the danger of doing that type of training, because I agree, it's dangerous, is there a way to get around that and still get that level of skill and that confidence without sort of bordering on that?
Not that I'm aware of, no. It's just the nature of the training when you're flying when you're flying a multi-engine aircraft. If there's a way around it, I can't think of what it might be. But beyond the philosophy of using technology as they do with the DA-42 to sort of ease the workload on the pilot. I mean, there's just with 6 levers there's always the odds that they're going to pull the wrong one, and the instructor has to be ready for that.
Absolutely. And, that's when the instructors get good too, because once you're an MEI, I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with your instructional technique anymore. It's literally just having faster hands than they do, I think. And, that's rule number 1 usually is no fast hands, but this is probably one exception where you got to get there first if they're going to pull the wrong lever, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are things that the industry's done to make it safer. I mean, there was a huge rash of multi-engine accidents back when engine failures used to be simulated at lower altitude. Of course, changes in FAA policy and training procedures have taken care of that. Because altitude is your friend. So if they screw something up and you don't catch it and it's at a sufficient altitude, no problem. You push the nose down and you get the speed you need and off you go. But just common sense is well, and experience has helped reduce the risk level. It's certainly a lot safer than it used to be. You look at the statistics, for multi-engine training, and they've improved dramatically.
Sure. So let's bring that back then to our sort of hierarchy we were talking about. So somebody graduates from general aviation. Let's say they graduate as being a multi-engine pilot with a CFI. Then they're going to go ahead and get that job. And now they've moved up, let's say one rung on the ladder. What comes next as far as that pilot's career and the track it's going to take? Because I know a lot of people go to the regionals, and that's when the burnout starts. And I've seen so many people get stuck there for so long that, they end up maybe going on to another track, or they, start coming up with different ideas. But the problem is, by now they may have a family, and they probably still have a ton of that debt that we were talking about before. So what would you say to somebody who's sort of been in this industry that is so known for like snake charming you into all the glory of being a pilot, and then you get to the grueling reality of being just one rung up from the bottom and realize that it's not really that way, and it might not be that way for a long time or ever?
Yeah, it's tough. And a lot of these things are circumstances that are out of the person's control. One of the guys that I used to fly with at my last job, he went to Embry-Riddle and came out with 6 figures of debt. And he was in school right around the time that 9/11 happened. And I mean, the prospects went from really great to really bad right before he graduated. And he ended up flying for a military contractor in Afghanistan, living literally out in the middle of a war zone for, must have been 4 or 5 years in order to pay off that debt. And he's done it. I mean, he is debt-free and onto a good career path. But so much of it is just timing. I mean, the people who got into aviation 10 years before versus the people 10 years after. I mean, their prospects are so dramatic, but there's nothing anybody could have done about that. What I would say to people is, and I know what you're talking about. You're talking about people who go in because they love aviation, and after they've been, let's say, at a pretty tough regional or on a tough schedule for a number of years, it's just a job to them. They'd actually rather not be at the airport. They don't have that love of flying anymore. I hate to see that destroyed, to go from that kid on that 727 where everything is wondrous to someone for whom it is nothing but a job, and not even a job that they love anymore. It's tough to see. It really is. And I think one of the things people can do is try to keep something going in their lives, some connection to aviation that will retain that spark and that joy, whether it's volunteering or doing Young Eagles flights, or maybe being a docent at a museum, and surrounding yourself with people who still have that wonder about aviation. Because for the most part, you don't find it at a modern airport. You don't walk around and see people in awe of aviation anymore. To them, it's like being on a bus. And that's probably not where the magic is anymore. But it's tough. I mean, people can also keep their options open. There are other parts of aviation that go beyond airlines. There are good corporate jobs out there. There are bad ones as well. There are good charter operators. There are some pretty lousy ones. So it runs the full gamut. But the problem with the airlines is once you get in there, it all runs on seniority. So once you've been there a while, you feel like you can't leave because you're going to lose what you've already got. And that's tough. So if someone's got a lot of debt and a family and a job like that in a tough economy, man, there's no easy outs. There really aren't.
No, I couldn't agree more. And, as you talk, I'm thinking about my own career and friends of mine and the paths that they've followed. And looking back on all of my friends from college, I can only think of about 2 that are actually doing the thing that we all thought we were going to be doing, where they just went through college, got the degree, went to a regional, made captain, went on to a major. That's it. Done deal.
Right.
Literally 2 people of all my friends that I can think of that have done that. And I think it's a good thing because, as you talked about earlier and in your article, square peg, round hole, you've got to find something that's a really good fit. And maybe we should talk about what people could do to maybe identify the type of person that they are and the type of place in the industry that might be a good fit for them. Do you have any advice for people on that?
Well, it's going to be different for each person. The first thing I'd say is to kind of educate yourself about what's out there. So I think you have to kind of widen your perspective a little bit. But each person's circumstances are going to be different. I mean, if you're someone who, let's say, has a wife and a kids when you're very young, you're probably not going to be taking a job bush flying. Even if that's a love of yours, it's just going to be a situation that might be untenable for a family. So everyone's got different circumstances, and I hate to say this, but part of it's luck. I look at my own career and how I started in business aviation, and I've been very, very fortunate. I happened to meet the right people, and I met them at a fortuitous time in my career. I meet people who were very successful, very generous, very kind, and gave me the entree into this section of aviation that I'm now in. Um, and again, part of it is good fortune. I happen to be learning to fly in Orange County, living in Orange County, and teaching here. And Orange County is a place where I think there's maybe 4 million people in this county, and it has two airports. All right, there's John Wayne and Fullerton. I'm just counting the fact we have a military field, Los Alamitos, but that we won't count that. So if you're from any of the wealthy areas, Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, Huntington Beach, anything with the word beach in it, you're probably going to learn to fly at John Wayne Airport. So there's a lot of money floating around, a lot of connections, and it was a good place to be, and still is. We're blessed with good weather and things like that. So, it's going to be different for every person. But yeah, if something's not working, you can either keep grinding and trying to make it work and trying to fit that square peg into that round hole, or you can try something else. I think it's very hard for people who have a job in a tough industry like aviation to leave that and go somewhere else, even if they're not necessarily happy.
Sure.
But we're also in a much different world than we were, say, 10 years ago. I mean, now there's definitely a labor shortage in terms of aviators, and the shoe's kind of on the other foot. So people can advance pretty rapidly in this economy. I know in business aviation, NBAA recently has been doing some studies and things to find out what they can do to retain good, talented individuals. Not just pilots, mechanics, and others. And of course, no surprise, it comes down to pay and quality of life. And so I've noticed that there's been a definite increase in both of those things for pilots. How long that'll last, I mean, it's all dependent upon the economy. But my feeling is that the good times should keep rolling for a while because, uh, unlike a lot of other industries, it takes a long time to make a pilot. If someone's looking for a pilot for, let's say, a G550, they're probably looking for someone with 7 or 8,000 hours of flight experience, someone who's been flying for quite some time, and it takes years and years to build up that kind of training and experience. So and from about 2008 to about 2013, 2014, really very few people learned how to fly. I mean, the economy was bad. The public's appetite for debt had disappeared. It was tough to get loans. A lot of places where people were getting loans had dried up. So there really weren't a lot of people who trained. And at that exact same time, the age 60 rule turned into the age 65 rule. And it sort of delayed retirements for about 5 years from the airline industry. And all that sort of masked this growing chasm between the labor needs and the labor pool. So it's going to take a while for that to change.
Yeah. Well, looking at your career now, where it's at, you get to fly world-class, top-of-the-line aircraft for a world-class Fortune, 50, 100, I'm not sure where, but company, and to great destinations, and it's a place that actually looks to take care of you both by paying you well and treating you well. Would you say that you've reached the top of our hierarchy, or is there still more to go?
Great question. I think I'm pretty close to the top. I mean, there's certainly advancement that you can do within the company. I just started with them. I mean, I'm a PIC rated pilot for them. I could act as pilot in command on the aircraft and things like that, no problem. But there's always somewhere you can go. There's always new challenges you could take on in the industry. For example, one of the things that was kind of interested me was NBAA has a certification, a CAM certification, they call it, a Certified Aviation Manager. It's sort of a vocational qualification that basically in pursuing this, you learn a lot about how flight departments run, about budgeting, about things like that. And it kind of gives you the skills to be more on the management side of things. And not that that's my aspiration. I actually am probably less interested in that than anybody else, but I'm I love to continue learning, to adding to my repertoire, if you will. So there are always new places to go. And especially in business aviation, I think it's a very exciting time to be in this side of the world, of the aviation world. Ariane has a supersonic business jet in development. I have a sneaking suspicion that Gulfstream has one in development as well. They're a company who tends to just, not announce a product and then make it 10 years later. They announce it and say, hey, look, we already built one. In fact, that's what they did with the G500 and G600. They announced it on the same day they rolled one out of the factory right up to the announcement. So and there's a number of other companies that are working on this. So I think the future is supersonic, and it's going to be appearing first in the business aviation world. So I think that's pretty exciting. If you Google the Ariane AS2 and look at some of the artwork, some of the renderings, it's pretty amazing. It looks like something out of a Star Wars movie more than a traditional contemporary aircraft.
To close this out here, what advice would you have for both a young person who's at the very, very, very bottom, grinding it out in a 152, looking to have a career in aviation, and what would you say to somebody who's maybe a little further along in their career doing something else, hating it, and wants to go into aviation, but is a little hesitant about pulling the trigger? What advice would you have for those people?
I think I would actually give them both the same advice, which is that life is short. If there's something you want to do, you should go out there and do it. I mean, it's funny walking through Orange County, I see people who have thousands of dollars in net worth, and I see people that have billions of dollars in net worth. It runs the full gamut. People have, vastly differing amounts of wealth. But the one thing we all have in about roughly equal measure is time. And every time that sun goes down, one more day of your life, however long it may be, one more day of your life is now in the past, and you now have one less day in front of you. We spend a third of our lives sleeping, and the remaining 2/3 are basically spent between, work and not work. So I feel like if there's something you want to do, go do it. That's what I would do. I mean, life's too short to do something you hate all day for a living, even if that means getting out of aviation once you've tried it. But I think people get to the end of their lives and they're going to spend a lot more time regretting the things they haven't done than the things that they did do. So I think it's a good time for aviation. And if someone's looking for a career change or they're just at the start, I say, enjoy every moment of it. Don't just look to the next thing. Don't just say, I'll be happy when I get to that 747 or that Airbus or whatever it is. Enjoy where you are now, the experiences, the people you're going to meet, the wonder of it all. Because it's a hell of a ride. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to what's to come.
I've listened to that interview a lot of times. Not even after I edited it. I've listened to it all the way through like 5 more times after. And I just can't get over how on point Ron is about everything. If you want more Ron, go to the House of Rapp at rapp.org. That's spelled RAPP. And as always, there are links in the show notes. Make sure to stay connected to the podcast on Instagram at Podcasting on a Plane and at Twitter at Podcast on a Plane. And links for everything can be found at podcastingonaplane.com. And until next time, good day.
I'm Paula from San Diego. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while Brandon is a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.